Sometimes the most beautiful moments in life come when we least expect them, and often when we feel least worthy of them. In a world that constantly tells us we're not enough, the story of Prudence and Luka reminds us that true love sees past every flaw and finds beauty in every imperfection. In 1874, Wyoming, Luka Blackwood had been waiting 7 days for his mail-order bride. When Prudence finally arrived, she was nothing like her photograph. She was older, heavier, and ashamed of being so late. Most men would have turned her away. But Luka looked at this tired woman stepping off the dusty wagon and saw exactly what he needed. He smiled and said the words that changed everything. "You're right on time for me." This is their story of finding love when both had given up hope. What happens when two broken hearts discover they fit together perfectly? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind that swept down from the Teton Peaks carried stories in its voice, tales of men who had come to this territory seeking something they couldn't name, and women who had followed hope across 1,000 miles of unforgiving prairie. Luka Blackwood understood that wind. He had been listening to it for 5 years now, ever since he'd built his cabin in the shadow of these ancient mountains and declared himself done with the world of men. His fingers moved methodically across the piece of pine in his lap, the sharp blade of his knife peeling away thin curls of wood that fell like snow onto his worn boots. The wooden cross was taking shape slowly, as all good things did in this place where time moved to the rhythm of seasons rather than clocks. He carved in the evenings when the mountain silence grew too heavy, when memories of cannon smoke and dying boys threatened to crowd his thoughts. The simple repetition of blade against wood kept his hands steady and his mind anchored to the present. The cabin around him bore the marks of a man who had learned to depend on no one but himself. Every log had been felled by his axe, every chink filled with mud and moss by his own hands. The stone fireplace drew cleanly, warming the single room that served as kitchen, parlor, and workshop. His bed occupied one corner, a simple frame he'd built to hold a mattress stuffed with pine needles that he changed with each season. Shelves lined the walls, holding his few books, his tools, and the practical necessities of mountain life: ammunition, dried meat, medicines, and the small luxuries he allowed himself: coffee beans and sugar from his twice-yearly trips to town. He had fought at Gettysburg and Antietam, had seen boys from Ohio and Virginia fall into the same blood-soaked earth. The war had taken something from him that he couldn't quite name. Not his courage, not his capacity for feeling, but perhaps his faith that the world made sense. When the fighting ended, he had tried to return to his family's farm in Pennsylvania, had attempted to court the banker's daughter who had waited for him through 4 long years. But the smell of turned earth reminded him too much of graves, and the sound of her laughter seemed to come from across an unbridgeable distance. So he had come west with the wave of men seeking new starts in territories where the past mattered less than a man's willingness to work. He had tried mining first, then cattle ranching, but nothing suited him until he found this valley tucked between granite walls where a man could live according to his own rhythms. Here the only battles were against weather and wildlife, struggles that made sense in ways that human conflicts never had. But 5 years of solitude had taught him something unexpected, that a man could be complete in himself and still hunger for something more. The realization had come gradually, creeping up on him during the long winter evenings when the wind spoke of lives being lived beyond these mountains. He found himself wondering what it would be like to share the morning coffee, to have someone notice when he came back from hunting, to speak aloud the thoughts that accumulated in the silence. The decision to place an advertisement for a wife had not come easily. He had ridden to Cheyenne 3 times before finally walking into the newspaper office, his carefully written notice folded in his shirt pocket. Honest man, 34 years, seeks companionate wife for frontier life. Must be of good character and willing spirit. Comfortable home provided. Reply to L. Blackwood, General Delivery, Medicine Bow Station, Wyoming Territory. The responses had surprised him. Dozens of letters from women across the eastern states, each carrying its own story of loss or longing. Some were too young, barely out of girlhood, and seeking adventure they couldn't comprehend. Others seemed desperate in ways that made him uncomfortable. But one letter had stood out, written in careful script on good paper, bearing the measured tone of a woman who had considered her words carefully. "Dear Mr. Blackwood," it had begun. "I am Prudence Dalton, widow of Missouri, age 38 years. I have read your notice with interest, as I find myself in circumstances that require a change of situation. I am of sound health and good character, skilled in all domestic arts, and possess a calm temperament suited to frontier life. I do not write from romantic fancy, but from practical necessity, though I hope we might find companionship in our arrangement. If you find my qualifications suitable, I am prepared to make the journey west." Something in her direct manner had appealed to him. She wrote as an equal, neither pleading nor presuming, but simply stating her case. Her photograph, a formal studio portrait that accompanied her third letter, showed a pleasant-faced woman with serious eyes and carefully arranged hair. Not beautiful in the fashionable sense, but possessing a quality of steadiness that seemed to look out at him from the daguerreotype. Their correspondence had continued through the spring and summer. She wrote of her life as a seamstress in Kansas City, of the difficulty of supporting herself after her husband's death from consumption. He shared details of mountain life, of the challenges and rewards of frontier existence. Gradually, their letters grew warmer, more personal. She told him of her love for books, her skill with medicinal herbs, her dream of having a garden where she could grow vegetables and flowers. He wrote of his hope for children someday, his longing for conversation and shared purpose. They had agreed she would arrive by the 1st of October, when the worst of summer's heat had passed, but before winter's grip tightened on the territory. He had spent weeks preparing for her arrival, adding feminine touches to his austere cabin: curtains for the windows, a proper washstand, a rocking chair positioned to catch the morning light. He had built a small addition to serve as a separate bedroom, understanding that their arrangement would require careful negotiation of intimacy and independence. October 1st had come and gone, without sign of her. Then the 2nd, the 3rd. By the 4th day, he had ridden down to Medicine Bow Station to inquire after delayed stages or messages. The station master, a grizzled man named Hoskins, who had seen every variety of frontier disappointment, had shaken his head sympathetically. "Happens more often than not," Hoskins had said, tobacco juice staining his graying beard. "Folks back east get ideas about the territory, but when it comes time to actually make the journey, well, that's another matter entirely." Could be she changed her mind. Could be family talked her out of it. Could be she found herself a better situation. Luka had ridden home each evening, telling himself he would wait one more day. He was not a man given to false hopes, but something in Prudence's letters had convinced him of her sincerity. She had written with the voice of someone who understood hardship and made decisions carefully. It seemed unlike her to simply disappear without word. On the 7th day, as he sat carving his wooden cross and watching the sun sink behind the western peaks, he heard the distant sound of wagon wheels on stone. The sound was so unexpected that he thought at first it might be the wind playing tricks. But it came again, closer now, accompanied by the creak of leather and the snort of tired horses. He set down his carving and stepped out onto the porch he had built with Prudence in mind. Its roof, designed to shelter them both during the long mountain winters. The wagon that rounded the bend in the trail was a battered thing, its canvas cover stained and patched, pulled by 2 horses that moved with the careful gait of animals pushed near their limits. The driver was a man Luka recognized, Pete Morrison, who made supply runs between the settlements and sometimes carried passengers for extra coin. But it was the figure beside him on the wagon seat that made Luka's breath catch in his throat. Even at a distance, even though she looked nothing like the delicate woman in the photograph, He knew it was Prudence. She was larger than he had expected, her face fuller, her frame more substantial beneath the travel-worn dress. Her hair, which had been so carefully arranged in the studio portrait, hung loose and windblown beneath a practical bonnet. But it was the way she held herself that told him everything he needed to know about the week he had been waiting. She sat straight despite obvious exhaustion, her chin raised in the manner of someone preparing to face judgment. The wagon drew to a halt in front of his porch, and Pete Morrison climbed down with the stiff movements of a man who had spent too many hours on a hard seat. "Got a passenger for you, Blackwood," he called out, but his voice carried an undertone of uncertainty, as if he wasn't quite sure this delivery would be welcomed. Prudence Dalton remained seated for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some point beyond Luka's shoulder. When she finally looked at him directly, he saw in her gaze a complex mixture of hope, shame, and defiant resignation. She climbed down from the wagon with careful dignity, her movements betraying both physical exhaustion and emotional strain. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying the same measured tone he remembered from her letters, though it trembled slightly now. "I am Prudence Dalton. I know I'm late, and I know I'm not what you expected. If you wish to send me back with Mr. Morrison, I will understand completely." Luka stepped down from his porch, the wooden cross still in his hand, wood shavings clinging to his shirt. Up close, he could see the lines of fatigue around her eyes, the way her dress hung loose in places and tight in others, evidence of recent illness and hardship. But he could also see the courage it had taken for her to make this journey, to face this moment when reality would be measured against hope. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle as mountain snow. "You're right on time for me." Pete Morrison cleared his throat and spat into the dust, clearly uncomfortable with the tension that hung between the two strangers. "Well then," he said, hefting Prudence's single carpet bag from the wagon bed, "I'll be getting back before dark catches me on the trail." He set the bag down with more gentleness than his gruff manner suggested and touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, Blackwood," without another word. He climbed back onto his wagon and urged his tired horses forward, leaving Luka and Prudence alone in the gathering dusk. The silence stretched between them like a chasm neither quite knew how to cross. Prudence's hand moved instinctively to the small brown bottle hidden in her dress pocket, the laudanum that had become both necessity and shame during the difficult journey west. The constant ache in her lower back, a reminder of years spent hunched over sewing in poor light, had worsened during the long hours in uncomfortable wagon seats and makeshift beds. "Your letters spoke true about the beauty of this place," she said finally, her voice steadier now that the moment of reckoning had passed without immediate rejection. The mountains rose around them like cathedral walls, their peaks catching the last golden light of day. "I confess I had not imagined anything quite so grand." Luka picked up her carpetbag, noting its weight and quality. Whatever had delayed her journey, it hadn't been preparation. The bag was well made and carefully packed. "Winter comes early this high up," he said, leading her toward the cabin. "But there's a beauty in that too when you get used to it. The silence after a snowfall, there's nothing like it in the civilized world." The cabin's interior struck Prudence with its unexpected warmth. She had prepared herself for bachelor quarters, rough-hewn and purely functional. Instead, she found herself in a space that spoke of a man who took pride in his surroundings. The logs were carefully chinked, the floor swept clean, and someone had hung curtains at the windows, simple fabric, but hemmed with care. "You weren't expecting a woman's touch," she observed, running her fingers along the curtain fabric. "These are well made." "Ordered them from the catalogue," Luka admitted, a slight flush coloring his weathered cheeks. "Seemed like something a lady might appreciate." He gestured toward the rocking chair, positioned near the fireplace. "Please sit. You look ready to drop." Prudence sank into the chair with relief she couldn't quite hide. The journey from Kansas City had been a trial beyond anything she had imagined when she first answered his advertisement. Cholera had swept through the wagon train outside of Fort Laramie, delaying them for 2 weeks while the sick either recovered or died. She had spent those weeks nursing others, her own constitution weakened by poor food and worse water. "I owe you an explanation for my tardiness," she began. But Luka raised a hand to stop her. "You're here now," he said simply, moving to the stove where a pot of stew had been simmering. "The reasons can wait until you've had a proper meal and some rest." He ladled the stew into 2 bowls, the aroma filling the small space with scents of venison and vegetables. "I'm not much of a cook, but it's filling and clean." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her carefully maintained composure. In Kansas City, she had grown accustomed to skeptical looks, to questions about her intentions and qualifications. Here was a man offering simple hospitality without judgment, at least for now. They ate in companionable quiet, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant call of an owl beginning its nightly hunt. Prudence found herself studying her host when she thought he wasn't looking. He was larger than she had expected, his shoulders broad from years of physical labor, his hands scarred but gentle as he handled the simple crockery. Gray touched his dark hair at the temples, and lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting into mountain distances. "The cholera," she said finally, unable to bear the weight of unspoken explanation any longer. "It struck the wagon train outside Fort Laramie. We lost 12 souls before it ran its course." She set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly gone. "I stayed to help nurse the sick. It seemed the Christian thing to do, though it meant you risked your own health to care for strangers," Luka finished quietly. "That tells me more about your character than any letter could have." His words hit her like a physical blow, so unexpected was their kindness. She had prepared herself for anger, disappointment, even dismissal. Instead, he offered understanding that she hadn't dared hope for. "I'm not the woman in that photograph anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The journey, the illness, I know I must look. You look like someone who's traveled 1,000 miles to start a new life," Luka said firmly. "That takes a kind of courage most folks never have to find." He stood and began clearing their bowls. "As for the photograph, well, I've learned that pictures capture moments, not people. The woman who wrote those letters, who made this journey despite every hardship, that's who I was hoping to meet." Prudence felt tears threaten for the first time since beginning this journey. She had armored herself against rejection, against the possibility that her changed appearance would doom this last hope for companionship. His acceptance, offered so simply and completely, left her defenseless against emotions she had kept carefully contained. "There's a room I built for you," Luka continued, as if he hadn't just spoken words that would echo in her heart for years to come. "Nothing fancy, but it's private and warm. We can work out the other arrangements as we go, no rush about anything." The small addition he showed her was perfect in its simplicity. A narrow bed with clean linens, a washstand with pitcher and basin, a small window that looked out toward the peaks. Someone had placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the washstand, mountain asters, an Indian paintbrush that must have taken time to gather. "The flowers," she began, "thought they might make the place seem more welcoming," he said, suddenly awkward. "I can take them out if you prefer." "No," she said quickly. "They're lovely. I can't remember the last time someone picked flowers for me. That night, lying in the narrow bed, while wind whispered through the pines outside her window, Prudence allowed herself to hope for the first time in months. The laudanum bottle remained unopened in her bag, somehow. The constant ache that had plagued her for weeks seemed diminished here, in this high place, where the air was clean and the silence profound. In the main room, Luka sat by the dying fire with his carving knife and the wooden cross that was slowly taking shape. But his hands remained still, his thoughts occupied with the woman sleeping in the next room. She was not what he had expected, older, worn by hardship, carrying secrets he could sense but not yet name. But there was something in her manner, a quality of endurance and grace under pressure, that spoke to parts of himself he had thought buried with the war. He had learned to read people during his army years, to see past surface appearances to the character underneath. What he saw in Prudence Dalton was a woman who had faced disappointment and loss without becoming bitter, who had maintained her dignity despite circumstances that might have broken others. The way she had spoken of nursing cholera victims. The careful way she had prepared for this meeting despite her obvious exhaustion. These were the actions of someone worthy of respect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began the delicate process of learning to live together, to build something resembling a partnership from the foundation of their careful correspondence. But tonight, for the first time in years, his cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a home. Outside, the mountain wind carried new stories in its voice, tales of two people who had found each other across great distances, who might yet discover that the best kinds of love grew not from perfection, but from the courage to accept and be accepted exactly as they were. The first light of dawn painted the mountain peaks rose and gold, filtering through the cabin's east-facing window to wake Prudence from the deepest sleep she'd known in weeks. For a moment she lay still and confused. The unfamiliar sounds of mountain morning, wind in the pines, the distant call of a hawk, slowly reminding her where she was and why. From the main room came the quiet sounds of someone moving carefully, trying not to wake a sleeping household. The creak of floorboards, the soft clink of metal against metal, the whisper of kindling catching fire. Luka was already up, beginning the day's work with the same methodical care she had observed in everything he did. She dressed quickly in her plainest dress, braiding her hair with practiced efficiency before venturing into the main room. Luka stood at the stove, coffee pot in hand, his movements economical and sure. He had changed from the previous evening's clothes into worn work pants and a flannel shirt that had seen many washings. "Morning?" he said without turning around, somehow sensing her presence. "Coffee's almost ready. I hope you're not one of those folks who needs it weak." "Strong enough to wake the dead, if you please," Prudence replied, surprised by the easy way the words came. In Kansas City, she had grown accustomed to measuring every phrase, to walking carefully around the sensibilities of potential employers and landlords. Here, something in the mountain air seemed to encourage honesty. Luka handed her a tin cup filled with coffee, so black it might have been used to waterproof boots. She took a sip and felt her eyes water, but also felt more awake than she had in days. "That will certainly serve," she managed, and was rewarded with what might have been a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I usually start the day checking on the animals," he said, pulling on a coat that hung by the door. 3 horses, a milk cow, and some chickens that think they run the place. You're welcome to come along, get a feel for how things work around here." The morning air was sharp enough to cut glass, carrying scents of pine and granite and something indefinably clean that city air never possessed. Prudence pulled her shawl tighter and followed Luka toward a collection of sturdy buildings that spoke of a man who built things to last. The horses nickered soft greetings as Luka approached their paddock. 2 were the sturdy mountain horses common to the territory, built for endurance rather than beauty. The 3rd was different, a grey mare with intelligent eyes and an elegant head that suggested better breeding. "That's Minerva," Luka said, noting Prudence's interest. "Belonged to an army officer who sold her cheap when he transferred back east. Too delicate for frontier work, he claimed, but I think he just didn't understand her." The mare came to the fence at his call, accepting an apple slice with dignified pleasure. "She's beautiful," Prudence murmured, extending her hand carefully. The mare sniffed delicately, then allowed the touch, her skin soft as velvet beneath the winter coat she was growing. "Horses are good judges of character," Luka observed, watching the interaction. "Minerva doesn't take to everyone." They moved on to the cow, a placid creature who provided milk and butter in exchange for hay and grain. The chickens, as advertised, did indeed seem to believe they owned the place, clustering around Luka's feet with imperious demands for their morning corn. "I've never been much around farm animals," Prudence admitted, watching the efficiency with which he performed the morning chores. "In the city, our milk came from a cart, and our eggs from the market." "Different kind of life," Luka agreed, scattering grain with practiced sweeps of his arm. "Takes some getting used to, but there's something satisfying about knowing where your food comes from." about being part of the whole cycle of things. Back in the cabin, Prudence insisted on preparing breakfast, despite Luka's protests that she was a guest and should rest. Moving around the compact kitchen, she began to understand the careful thought he had put into its arrangement. Everything had its place, chosen for efficiency and ease of use. "You've organized this well," she said, finding flour and salt and the other necessities for biscuits. "Most bachelor quarters I've seen are less thoughtful." "Had time to work out the details," Luka replied, settling at the table with his leather-bound journal. She watched from the corner of her eye as he made careful notations: the weather, the condition of the animals, observations about the changing season. His handwriting was neat and precise, the hand of someone who had learned to keep accurate records. "Is that a daily practice?" she asked, mixing biscuit dough with the same attention to detail she had once applied to fine embroidery. "Started it during the war," he said, not looking up from his writing. "Seemed important to keep track of things. What happened, what worked, what didn't. Habit stuck." He glanced up as she worked, noting the competent way she handled the simple ingredients. "You cook like someone who's done it before." "Had to learn when my husband took sick," Prudence replied, shaping the dough with quick, sure movements. "Turns out there's a difference between knowing how something should taste and knowing how to make it taste that way." The biscuits emerged from the oven golden and fragrant, served alongside eggs from Luka's imperious chickens and slices of ham from his smokehouse. They ate in comfortable quiet, the morning sun slanting through the windows to warm the small space. "I should warn you," Luka said as they finished eating, "I'm not much for conversation in the mornings. Mine's usually on the work that needs doing. I appreciate a peaceful morning," Prudence replied. "In the city, noise starts before dawn and doesn't stop until well after dark. The quiet here, it's like medicine for the soul." Something in her voice made him look at her more carefully. "You mentioned your husband was ill. That must have been difficult." Prudence's hands stilled on her coffee cup. "Consumption," she said simply. "Took 2 years to claim him. By the end, I was doing seamstress work during the day and nursing duties through the night." She met his eyes steadily. "I learned that a person can endure more than they think possible if they must. And after he passed, I kept taking and sewing, tried to make ends meet. But without his pension from the railroad, and with more women than work available," she shrugged, the gesture conveying volumes about the practical difficulties that had led her to answer his advertisement. "Must have taken courage to leave everything familiar," Luka observed. "Seemed less like courage than necessity at the time," Prudence replied. "Though I suppose sometimes they amount to the same thing." That afternoon, Luka began teaching her the basics of mountain life, with the same methodical approach he applied to everything else. How to bank the fire so it would hold through the night, which drawer held the medical supplies and how to use them, where he stored the winter provisions and how to make them last. "Nearest town is Medicine Bow Station. About 6 hours on horseback in good weather," he explained, showing her his carefully maintained supplies. "In winter, we might not get there for weeks at a time. Everything we need has to be here already, or we do without." The responsibility of it struck her, the weight of planning and foresight required to survive in such isolation. But there was also something appealing about the self-sufficiency, the way every decision mattered and every skill had practical value. As evening approached, they worked together to prepare supper, their movements gradually finding a rhythm around each other in the small kitchen. When their hands accidentally touched reaching for the same pot, neither pulled away immediately, and Prudence felt something warm uncurl in her chest, the first stirring of hope that this arrangement might become something more than mere survival. By the end of her first week in the mountains, Prudence had fallen into rhythms that surprised her with their rightness. She woke each morning to the sound of Luka moving quietly about his chores, the careful way he tried not to disturb her rest, speaking to a consideration she had not expected from a man living alone for 5 years. The coffee was always ready when she emerged from her small room, strong and hot and perfectly suited to the crisp mountain mornings. Her sewing kit, when she finally unpacked it from her carpet bag, drew Luka's attention like nothing else had. The elaborate case opened to reveal compartments lined with velvet, holding needles of every size, spools of thread, in colors ranging from practical browns and grays to luxurious silks in jewel tones. Scissors of different sizes nestled in their own fitted slots, alongside thimbles worn smooth by years of use, and a collection of buttons that spoke of projects both practical and beautiful. "That's some setup," Luka observed, running a careful finger along the mother-of-pearl handle of her finest embroidery scissors. "It looks like the tools of someone who takes their work seriously." "My grandmother's kit," Prudence explained, her voice carrying the weight of memory. "She was seamstress to a judge's family in St. Louis before she married my grandfather. Added to it over 40 years, then passed it to me when I married." She lifted out a spool of silk thread, the color of sapphires. "Some of these threads came all the way from France. Cost more than most folks see in a month. Must be hard to leave work like that behind," he said, noting the way her hands moved over the tools with the familiarity of long partnership. "Not leaving it behind," Prudence replied, a smile touching her lips for the first time since arriving. "Just changing what I'm sewing for. Your shirts could use some attention, and I noticed holes in your winter socks that will be trouble when the cold really sets in." That afternoon, she asked to see more of his land, curious about the boundaries of this life she was considering making her own. Luka saddled Minerva for her, adjusting the stirrups with the same careful attention he gave everything else. "She's gentle but smart," he said, helping Prudence into the saddle. "Trust her judgment if something spooks her. Horses know things we miss." They rode up the valley floor, following game trails that wound between stands of aspen and pine. The leaves had turned golden, carpeting the ground with color that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Prudence had ridden as a girl, but years of city life had made her stiff in the saddle. Gradually, though, muscle memory returned, and she found herself relaxing into Minerva's smooth gait. "How much land do you claim?" she asked as they paused at a stream that chattered over smooth stones. "About 1,000 acres, when you count the high meadows," Luka replied, letting his horse drink. "Not all of it's useful. Too steep or rocky for much besides timber. But there's good grazing up high in summer, and the stream never runs dry." The scale of it amazed her. In Kansas City, she had rented a single room in a boarding house, sharing kitchen privileges with 5 other women. It was space beyond her comprehension, land enough for a man to disappear into if he chose. "Does it ever feel too big?" she asked. "Too empty?" Luka considered the question seriously, as he seemed to consider everything. "Sometimes," he admitted, "especially in winter, when the snow's deep and you don't see another soul for weeks. But then spring comes, and you watch the whole valley wake up, and it feels like the most perfect place on earth." They rode further, climbing through stands of pine that grew larger and older as they gained elevation. Prudence marveled at trees that had been ancient when her grandparents were born, their trunks too large for 3 men to embrace. The silence here was profound, broken only by wind in the branches and the occasional cry of a hawk. "There," Luka said suddenly, pointing toward a break in the trees. "Elk." Prudence followed his gaze and saw them, a small herd moving through the forest with the fluid grace of wild things. A magnificent bull led them, his antlers spread wide as thrown arms, his coat already thick for winter. They paused in their feeding to watch the horses, unafraid but alert, ready to disappear at the first sign of threat. "They're beautiful," Prudence whispered, afraid to speak too loudly and break the spell. "Bulls like that one can weigh 700 pounds, Luka said quietly. "Fast as anything when they need to be, and smarter than most folks give them credit for. We'll hunt one of the younger bulls before winter, meat enough to last till spring if we're careful." The practical reality of frontier life had not truly struck her until that moment. In the city, meat came from the butcher, already cut and wrapped. Here, survival meant taking life with your own hands, accepting the responsibility that came with living off the land. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Prudence found herself speaking of things she had not shared with anyone since her husband's death. The fear that had driven her west, the nights spent lying awake, calculating how many weeks her savings would last. The humiliation of having her sewing rejected by customers who wanted perfection she could no longer provide, with tired eyes and aching hands. "Sounds like you were running towards something as much as away from it," Luka observed, whittling shavings from a piece of pine as he listened. "Perhaps," she agreed, "though I'm not sure I knew what I was running toward until I got here. And now?" Prudence looked around the cabin that had begun to feel familiar, at the man whose careful kindness had surprised her at every turn. "Now I'm beginning to understand what you meant in your letters about finding purpose in simple things. In the city, everything felt like surviving. Here, it feels more like living." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both that winter was coming. But inside, the fire burned warm, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Prudence felt truly safe. Not just from the elements or from want, but from the judgment and uncertainty that had shadowed her for so long. "Tomorrow I'll show you how to preserve meat," Luka said, banking the fire for the night. "And how to tell when a storm's coming by, watching the sky. Mountain weather can change fast." "I'd like that," Prudence replied, and meant it. Each new skill felt like armor against uncertainty, but more than that, it felt like becoming part of something larger than herself. For the first time since answering his advertisement, she began to believe this arrangement might work, not just as a matter of survival, but as something approaching happiness. A month into their arrangement, the rhythms of their shared life had settled into something that felt less like an experiment and more like a partnership. Prudence had mended every piece of clothing Luka owned, her skilled hands transforming threadbare shirts and patched trousers into garments that would serve him well through the coming winter. In return, he had taught her to read the mountain weather, to identify the edible plants that grew wild in the high meadows, and to handle his rifle with enough competence to defend herself if necessity arose. The morning brought unexpected visitors in the form of Reverend Joshua Whitfield and his wife Martha, traveling through the territory on their circuit preaching. Luka spotted their wagon from a distance and rode down to meet them, returning an hour later with the elderly couple in tow. "Don't get many visitors this far up," Luka explained to Prudence, as she hastily prepared the cabin for company. "Reverend Whitfield's been making this circuit for 15 years. Good man, even if his sermons run long." Reverend Whitfield proved to be a spare man with kind eyes and hands gentle enough to calm Luka's skittish horses. His wife was a plump, cheerful woman who immediately took charge of the kitchen with the assumption of someone accustomed to making herself useful wherever she landed. "Such a lovely setup you have here," Martha observed, noting the curtains and the care with which the cabin was maintained. "Takes a woman's touch to make a house truly comfortable." Prudence felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain how to explain their arrangement to these good church folk. But Luka stepped smoothly into the gap. "Mrs. Dalton arrived a month ago," he said easily. "We've been getting acquainted, seeing if we suit each other for a more permanent arrangement." "Ah," said Reverend Whitfield, his tone carefully neutral. "Well, the Lord works in mysterious ways to bring souls together. Perhaps we might speak of making such arrangements more official." That evening, as the Reverend delivered an impromptu sermon beside their fireplace, Prudence found herself stealing glances at Luka. His pocket watch, a silver timepiece that had belonged to his grandfather, lay open on the table beside him. She had noticed it before, but only now saw that it had stopped working. Its hands frozen at some moment in the past he chose not to discuss. "The sacrament of marriage," Reverend Whitfield was saying, "is not merely a convenience or a business arrangement, though practical considerations certainly have their place. It is a covenant before God, a promise to walk together through whatever trials life may bring." After the visitors retired to the barn for the night, Luka and Prudence sat by the dying fire, the weight of unspoken questions heavy between them. "He's not wrong about making things official," Luka said finally, his voice careful. "Folks in these parts are tolerant, but there are limits to what's considered proper." "And you?" Prudence asked. "What do you consider proper?" Luka was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of his broken pocket watch. I consider it proper for two people to know their own minds before making promises they'll be held to for life. Question is, do we know our minds? The honesty of it took her breath away. In her first marriage, the courtship had been brief and formal, guided more by her parents' approval than by any deep knowledge of the man she was wedding. Here was Luka offering her something different, the chance to choose with full knowledge of what that choice meant. "I know I've found something here I didn't expect," she said slowly. "Peace, I suppose, purpose, a sense that what I do matters to someone besides myself." "That's a start," Luka agreed. "But marriage, that's asking if you can stand to wake up next to the same person for the next 30 years. If you can weather sickness and disappointment and all the small daily irritations that wear couples down, and you think we can?" He looked at her then, with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I think you're the strongest woman I've ever met and the kindest. I think you've made this place feel like home, in ways I didn't know it was lacking. But I also think you deserve better than settling for a man just because he's convenient. Is that what you think this is? Convenience?" "I think," Luka said carefully, "that we both came to this arrangement for practical reasons. Question is whether something real has grown from that, or whether we're just comfortable with each other." The next morning, Reverend Whitfield approached the question with the delicacy of a man who had performed dozens of frontier weddings for couples in various states of acquaintance. "I could perform a ceremony this morning before we continue our journey," he offered over breakfast. "Simple affair, but binding in the eyes of God and man. Or if you prefer more time to consider, we'd be grateful for the ceremony," Luka said, his voice steady. "If Mrs. Dalton is agreeable." All eyes turned to Prudence, and she felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. This was it, the point where careful consideration gave way to faith, where the safety of uncertainty yielded to the risk of commitment. "Yes," she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "I'm agreeable." The ceremony was, indeed, simple, conducted in front of the cabin, with Martha Whitfield serving as witness, and the mountains themselves as cathedral walls. Prudence wore her best dress, the deep blue wool she had saved for special occasions, while Luka had put on a clean shirt and the jacket he usually reserved for trips to town. When Reverend Whitfield asked if she took this man as her husband, to have and to hold through all the seasons of life, Prudence found herself thinking not of romantic love, but of the quiet satisfaction she felt watching Luka work. The way he listened when she spoke, the careful consideration he gave to everything that mattered. "I do," she said, and meant it. When it came time for the kiss that sealed their union, Luka's lips were warm and gentle against hers, a promise rather than a claim. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they stood joined not just by words but by choice, by the deliberate decision to bind their lives together whatever might come. "Well then," Martha Whitfield said briskly, dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief, "that's settled. Now shall we have some of that excellent coffee to celebrate?" As the Whitfields prepared to continue their journey, Reverend Whitfield pulled Luka aside for a quiet word. "Take care of her," he said simply. "She's got the look of someone who's known hardship but hasn't let it make her hard. Those are the ones worth protecting." "Yes, sir," Luka replied. "I intend to." That afternoon, alone again in their cabin now, not just his, Prudence and Luka moved around each other with new awareness. They were married now, bound by law and custom and their own spoken promises. The question that hung unspoken between them was what that would mean when darkness fell and they faced their first night as husband and wife. That evening, as shadows lengthened across their valley and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Prudence stood at the small window of what had been her room, her mother's wedding ring heavy in her palm. She had kept it hidden since her arrival, wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of her carpet bag, unable to bring herself to wear it yet, unwilling to abandon it entirely. The simple gold band caught the lamplight, smooth from years of wear. Her mother had placed it on her finger the morning of her first wedding, speaking of the sacred trust between husband and wife, the promises that bound two lives together through joy and sorrow alike. Now, newly married to a man she was still learning to know, Prudence wondered if those same promises could grow from practical beginnings into something deeper. "You don't have to—" Luka's voice came from behind her, gentle and understanding. "There's no rush about anything. We can take this as slow as you need." She turned to find him standing in the doorway, having changed from his wedding clothes into the comfortable work shirt and trousers she had grown accustomed to seeing him wear. But there was something different in his manner, a careful consideration that spoke of a man trying to navigate unfamiliar territory with honor. "I know," she said softly. "You've been nothing but patient and kind. It's just, this feels more real now. More permanent, good real or frightening real." The question made her smile despite her nervousness. "Both, I think. I haven't shared a bed with anyone since my first husband died. Haven't been a wife in any sense that matters for over 3 years. Luka crossed the room slowly, giving her time to object if she wished. When he reached her side, he looked down at the ring in her palm with understanding. "Your mother's." "Hers and her mother's before that. I thought I'd buried it with my first marriage, but I couldn't seem to let it go." She looked up at him, searching his face for judgment and finding only compassion. "Would you mind if I wore it? I know it seems strange, carrying something from my past into our future, but it's part of who you are," Luka finished quietly. "And I married all of who you are, past included." He took the ring gently from her palm, his calloused fingers careful with the delicate metal. "May I?" Prudence held out her left hand, watching as he slipped the ring onto her finger with the same reverence she imagined he might show when handling something sacred. It fit perfectly as she had known it would, settling into place like a promise coming home. "There," he said, not releasing her hand immediately. "Now you're properly married." The touch of his skin against hers sent warmth racing up her arm, and for the first time since the ceremony, she felt truly like his wife. Not just in law, but in the deeper sense that came from choosing to trust another person with your vulnerabilities. "Luka," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes? I want this to be real. Not just the ceremony, but all of it. Us." Something shifted in his expression, a careful mask falling away to reveal the depth of feeling he had been holding in check. "Are you certain?" "I won't hold you to anything you're not ready for." Instead of answering with words, Prudence rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring into the gesture all the trust and hope and growing affection she had been afraid to voice. His response was immediate but gentle, his arms coming around her with a reverence that spoke of a man who understood the gift he was being offered. Their wedding night was tender rather than passionate, a careful exploration of boundaries and desires long held in check. Luka's touch was patient and considerate, guided by her responses rather than his own urgency. When they finally came together as husband and wife in truth, it was with the slow building of intimacy that promised deeper connections to come. Afterward, lying in the narrow bed that suddenly seemed perfectly sized for two people who fit together just right, Prudence listened to the steady rhythm of Luka's breathing and felt something settle deep in her chest. For the first time since her first husband's death, she was not alone in the darkness. "Prudence," Luka's voice was soft in the shadows. Thank you. For trusting me with this. With you." She turned in his arms to face him, able to make out the outline of his features in the starlight that filtered through the small window. "Thank you for being worthy of trust." The weeks that followed brought a new depth to their partnership. The careful politeness that had marked their earlier interactions gave way to the comfortable intimacy of people who belonged together. They learned each other's sleeping habits, how Luka sometimes thrashed and called out in his dreams, how Prudence curled into a tight ball when the temperature dropped. They discovered the domestic rhythms of truly shared life, the way she hummed while working, how he always checked the locks twice before bed, but with deeper intimacy came deeper vulnerabilities. 3 weeks after their wedding, The nightmares that had plagued Luka during his solitary years returned with renewed force. Prudence woke one night to find him sitting on the edge of their bed, his body rigid with tension, sweat beading his forehead despite the cool mountain air. "The dreams?" she asked softly, not wanting to startle him further. "Antietam," he said, his voice thick with old pain. "We lost so many boys that day. Sometimes I can still smell the smoke, still hear them calling for their mothers." Without hesitation, Prudence moved to sit beside him, her hand finding his shoulder and offering what comfort touch could provide. "Tell me about them. The boys, I mean. What were they like before the fighting?" The question surprised him. Most people wanted to know about the battles, the strategy, the glory and horror of war. No one had ever asked about the human faces behind the casualties. "Tommy Brennan from Ohio," he said slowly. "Couldn't have been more than 17, but he could play harmonica like an angel. Used to entertain the whole regiment around the campfire." He was quiet for a moment, remembering. "Private Stewart from Georgia. Enemy, technically, but we found his body with a letter to his sweetheart sewn into his coat. Same words I might have written if I'd had someone to write to then." "You carry them with you," Prudence observed. "All of them. Someone should," Luka replied. "Someone should remember that they were more than just names on a casualty list. Then we'll remember them together," she said simply. "When the dreams come, you can tell me their stories. Help me know them the way you did." It was then that Luka understood the true nature of what they had built together. Not just companionship or even love, but a partnership deep enough to share the weight of old griefs, strong enough to bear whatever scars they carried from their separate pasts. The letter arrived on a bitter November morning when the first heavy snow of the season had trapped them in their valley for 3 days. Pete Morrison appeared through the swirling white like a ghost, his beard caked with ice, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies and mail that had accumulated at Medicine Bow Station. "Thought you folks might be getting low on coffee and such," he said, stamping snow from his boots on their porch. "Got a letter for Mrs. Blackwood, too. Came through on the last stage, before the pass closed." Prudence's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope, recognizing immediately her sister Charlotte's careful script, despite the water stains and rough handling the letter had endured. Charlotte lived in St. Louis still, married to a banker and mother to 3 children who called Prudence Aunt Prue in their infrequent letters. "Bad news travels fast," Pete observed, noting her pale complexion. "Hope it ain't nothing too serious." Luka handed the mail carrier a cup of coffee laced with whiskey and settled him by the fire while Prudence retreated to the window to read her sister's words in private. The letter was dated 6 weeks earlier, meaning it had taken a circuitous route to reach their remote valley. "My dearest Prudence," it began, and already she could sense the urgency beneath Charlotte's usually measured prose. "I pray this letter finds you safe and well in your new circumstances. I write with news that may disturb you, but which you must know for your own protection." Prudence's breath caught as she continued reading, the words seeming to leap from the page with the force of old nightmares made manifest. "A man came to our house last week asking questions about you. He claimed to be a deputy marshal from Kansas City, investigating the death of your late husband. He had with him another man, rough-looking, the sort who makes his living finding people who don't wish to be found. They asked many questions about your departure, about where you might have gone, about any family you might have contacted." The paper crackled in Prudence's grip as she forced herself to continue reading, each word falling like stones into still water, sending ripples of fear through the careful peace she had built. "Prudence, they spoke of your husband's death in terms that suggest they believe it was not the consumption that took him. I did not tell them of your letters, nor give them any information that might lead them to you, but I fear others may not be so protective of your privacy. The marshal seemed particularly interested in reports that James died from a head injury rather than lung disease," the letter continued. But Prudence found herself unable to focus on the words, as memories she had buried deep began to surface with terrible clarity. James, her first husband, had indeed died from a head injury, the result of falling down the stairs during one of his drunken rages. What she had never told anyone, not even Charlotte, was that he hadn't fallen alone. She remembered that final night with crystalline precision. James returning home from the tavern in one of his black moods, looking for someone to blame for his latest business failure. The way he had grabbed her arm when she tried to retreat to their bedroom, his fingers leaving bruises that would take weeks to fade. The backhand that sent her stumbling against the wall, her vision swimming with stars. But this time had been different. This time, when he raised his hand to strike her again, she had pushed back. Not hard, not violently, but with enough force to send him stumbling backward toward the steep stairs that led to their second-floor apartment. His alcohol-clouded reflexes had failed him, and he had tumbled down those stairs with a sound like breaking timber. She had found him at the bottom, his neck bent at an impossible angle, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. For a long moment, she had simply stood there, feeling nothing but the absence of fear for the first time in 3 years of marriage. Then survival instinct had taken over. She had run upstairs, washed the blood from her lip, and changed into her nightgown before screaming for the neighbors. The doctor who examined James's body had found the lung disease that had been slowly killing him anyway. And in a frontier town where accidents were common and wives were often presumed innocent until proven otherwise, no one had questioned her story of hearing him fall during the night. James was buried quickly and quietly, with few mourners and fewer questions. Prudence? Luka's voice seemed to come from a great distance. She looked up to find him watching her with concern, Pete Morrison having apparently taken his leave while she was lost in terrible memory. "What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." She handed him the letter with hands that shook despite her efforts to control them. Watched his face grow grave as he read Charlotte's careful warnings, saw understanding dawn in his eyes, followed quickly by something that might have been calculation. "There's more to this story," he said quietly when he finished reading. It wasn't a question. Prudence nodded, unable to trust her voice. The secret she had carried for 3 years felt too large for her throat, too dangerous to speak aloud even here in their remote sanctuary. "Tell me," Luka said, settling beside her on the bench they had built to catch the morning sun. "All of it, so she did," haltingly at first, then with growing confidence as she saw no judgment in his eyes, only careful attention and growing protective anger. She told him about James's drinking, about the escalating violence that had made her a prisoner in her own home, about the final confrontation and the split second when she chose to defend herself rather than submit to another beating. "I didn't mean for him to die," she concluded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted him to stop hitting me. But when he fell, I didn't call for help right away. I stood there and watched him die, and I was glad." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, and the fire crackled in the grate, but between them lay only the weight of truth finally spoken. "You defended yourself," Luka said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had seen violence in all its forms. "Any court should recognize that as justifiable if it came to trial." "Should," Prudence repeated. "But will they? A woman's word against a dead man's reputation." James was well regarded in business circles. "I was nobody, a seamstress who married above her station." Luka was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he considered their options. When he spoke, his voice carried the steel of old battles and hard-won wisdom. "Then we make sure it doesn't come to trial," he said simply. "This is our home now, our territory. Any man who wants to take you from here will have to go through me first. Luka, you don't understand. I understand that you survived something that would have broken most people," he interrupted, his hand finding hers and holding tight. "I understand that you had the courage to start over, to build something good from the ashes of something terrible. And I understand that no one, Marshall, Bounty Hunter, or anyone else, is going to destroy what we've built here." His certainty should have comforted her, but Prudence knew the reality of frontier justice. If a determined lawman wanted to drag her back to Kansas City for trial, there would be little one mountain man could do to prevent it, no matter how well-intentioned. "What if they come here?" she asked. "What if they find us?" "Then we'll be ready for them," Luka replied. And something in his tone reminded her that this gentle man, who carved wooden crosses and worried about her comfort, had once been a soldier skilled in the arts of war. "But first, we need to know exactly what we're facing. Come spring, I'll ride to Medicine Bow Station and make some inquiries. Find out what kind of case they think they have, whether this is official business or someone with a personal interest in seeing you hang." That night, they lay awake, listening to the wind and planning for a future suddenly uncertain. The peace they had built together felt fragile now, threatened by ghosts from Prudence's past. But somehow sharing the burden made it lighter rather than heavier. For the first time since receiving Charlotte's letter, Prudence allowed herself to hope that love might prove stronger than the long arm of the law. Winter closed around their valley like a protective fist, sealing them away from the outside world with walls of snow that grew higher with each passing storm. But what should have been a season of peace became a time of preparation. As Luka transformed their remote cabin into something approaching a fortress, while teaching Prudence skills she had never imagined needing, the rifle lessons began the morning after Charlotte's letter arrived. Luka's collection of weapons, carefully maintained and stored in a locked cabinet, spoke of a man who understood that in frontier territory, the ability to defend oneself was often the difference between life and death. He selected a lighter carbine for Prudence, its stock worn smooth by years of use, but its action clean and reliable. "The most important thing is not to be afraid of it," he said, showing her how to hold the weapon properly, his hands guiding hers to the correct position. "Respect it, yes, it's a tool that can kill. But fear will make you hesitate when hesitation might cost everything." They practiced in the meadow behind the cabin, where the snow muffled the sharp crack of gunshots and tall pines provided natural targets. Prudence proved to be a surprisingly apt student, her seamstress's precision with fine work translating well to the careful alignment of sights and the steady squeeze of trigger. "You're thinking too much," Luka observed after she missed several shots in succession. "Don't aim at the tree, aim at a specific knot, a particular scar in the bark. See it clearly, then let your hands do what they've learned." When the shot finally rang true, sending bark flying from exactly the spot she had chosen, Prudence felt a grim satisfaction that had nothing to do with marksmanship and everything to do with the knowledge that she would not be helpless if trouble found them. "Good," Luka said simply. "Now do it 10 more times." The lessons expanded beyond shooting to include the strategic thinking that had kept him alive through 4 years of war. He showed her the approaches to their cabin, the places where attackers might take cover, the defensive advantages their position offered. The valley had only 2 ways in or out, the main trail they had used for supplies, and a treacherous mountain pass that only someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain could navigate safely. "If trouble comes, it'll likely be up the main trail," he explained, pointing out positions where a defender could command the entire approach. "The trees provide cover, and the trail's narrow enough that men can't spread out and flank us." "You speak as if you've planned this before," Prudence observed, noting the way his eyes catalogued every boulder and deadfall that might serve as cover. "A man doesn't survive Gettysburg without learning to read ground," Luka replied. "Every place has its strengths and weaknesses. Key is knowing them before you need them." As winter deepened, they received occasional news from the outside world through hardy trappers and mail carriers who braved the mountain passes. None brought word of pursuing lawmen, but each visitor left Prudence feeling exposed, wondering if their remote valley was truly as hidden as it seemed. Pete Morrison arrived again in early February, his pack animals laden with supplies and his beard white with frost. Over coffee and warmth, he shared the gossip that passed for news in frontier settlements. "Heard tell there's been a deputy marshal asking questions down in Cheyenne," he said, seemingly casual, but watching Prudence's reaction from the corner of his eye. "Kansas City man, they say. looking for someone who might have headed west last fall. Luka's hand found Prudence's beneath the table, a steadying pressure that helped her keep her voice level. "Many folks head west each fall," she said carefully. "Seems like a large territory to search." "True enough," Pete agreed. "Though I also heard he's got himself a tracker, Indian fellow who knows these mountains better than most. If they're serious about finding someone, winter won't stop them for long." After Pete left, Luka spent long hours at the cabin's single window, his field glasses trained on the distant ridges where the trail wound through stands of pine and aspen. His old army instincts had awakened fully now, and Prudence often found him standing motionless as a hunting cat, listening to sounds she couldn't hear, watching for movement in the winter landscape. "They'll come when the weather breaks," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, his voice carrying the certainty of long experience. "March, maybe April, when the passes are clear, but before the spring melt makes travel difficult. And you think we can stop them?" Luka was quiet for a moment, his fingers working automatically at a piece of pine as he considered their options. "Depends on what they want more, justice or convenience. If they're determined to take you back for trial, they'll keep coming until they succeed or die trying. But if they can be convinced that the cost is higher than the prize—" "You mean if we kill them?" Prudence said, the words falling into the warm cabin like stones into still water. "I mean if we demonstrate that taking you from here will require a level of violence they're not prepared for," Luka corrected gently. "Sometimes showing strength prevents the need to use it." The distinction felt academic to Prudence, but she trusted Luka's judgment in matters of conflict. He had survived battles that claimed thousands, had learned the brutal mathematics of violence and defense. If anyone could keep them safe, it would be him. As February gave way to March, their preparations intensified. Luka cached supplies at strategic points around their valley, ammunition, medical supplies, dried food that would keep them alive if they were forced to abandon the cabin. He taught Prudence the locations of these caches, making her memorize landmarks and distances until she could find them blindfolded. "If something happens to me," he said matter-of-factly, "you'll need to know how to survive on your own until you can reach help." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Prudence replied firmly. "We're in this together." "Hope you're right," Luka said. "But hope doesn't win battles. Preparation does." The first sign of approaching trouble came on a clear morning in late March, when Luka spotted smoke rising from the distant ridgeline where no smoke should be. Two columns, thin and straight, rising from what his map told him was an abandoned trapper's cabin about 10 miles down the valley. "Could be trappers," Prudence suggested hopefully. "Or travelers taking shelter." "Could be," Luka agreed, but his tone suggested he believed otherwise. "Or it could be men who want to scout our position before making their approach." That night, they slept fully clothed with weapons within easy reach. Luka had rigged a simple alarm system using string and tin cans that would alert them if anyone approached the cabin in darkness. Every sound from the forest, the crack of a branch, the call of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine needles, seemed magnified in the tense silence. "Luka," Prudence whispered as they lay listening to the night sounds. "If they take me—" "They won't," he said firmly. "I won't let them. But if they do, I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. Whatever happens, I'm grateful for the time we've had." In the darkness, she felt him turn toward her, his hand finding her face with gentle precision. "Nothing's going to happen," he said, but his voice carried an edge that spoke of promises made to himself as much as to her. "This is our home, our life. No one takes that from us without paying a price higher than they're willing to bear." The next morning brought clear skies and the distant sound of horses moving carefully through the forest. Luka's field glasses revealed 2 riders picking their way up the valley trail, moving with the careful pace of men who knew they were entering dangerous territory. "This is it," he said quietly, lowering the glasses and checking his rifle for what might be the last time. "Whatever happens now, remember that I love you. Remember that you're worth fighting for." Prudence nodded, her own weapon steady in hands that no longer trembled. She thought of James, of the woman she had been in Kansas City, frightened, beaten down, accepting violence as inevitable. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who would stand and fight for the life she had built, and the man who had shown her what love could be. "Let them come," she said, and meant it. "We're ready for them." The two riders emerged from the tree line just after noon, their horses picking careful steps through the patches of snow that still lingered in the shadows. Even at a distance, their purpose was unmistakable. They rode with the deliberate pace of men, conducting official business, alert but not hurried, confident in their authority and mission. Luka's brass army compass lay open on the table before him, its needle pointing steadily north, even as everything else in their world seemed to shift toward uncertainty. He had used that compass to navigate through battlefields shrouded in smoke, to find direction when chaos threatened to consume everything familiar. Now it seemed to offer the same steady guidance as he prepared for what might be his final battle. Deputy Marshal, he identified through his field glasses, noting the badge that caught sunlight on the lead rider's coat, and his tracker. "Moving slow, giving us time to see them coming. That's either confidence or courtesy." Prudence stood at his shoulder, her carbine held with the easy competence he had spent months teaching her. "What do we do?" "We let them come close enough to talk," Luka replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of long experience. "But not close enough to take you without a fight." The lawman approached to within 50 yards of the cabin before Luka stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. The message was clear. They were welcome to talk, but not to trespass. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the crisp mountain air. "State your business." The lead rider, a man of middle years with graying hair visible beneath his hat, raised his hand in a gesture of peaceful intent. "Deputy Marshal Frank Garrett, Kansas City jurisdiction. I'm looking for a woman named Prudence Dalton. Understand she might have passed through these parts, and if she did," Luka replied, noting how the tracker, a lean man with the weathered face of someone who had spent his life reading signs in wilderness, sat silent but alert, his eyes constantly scanning the cabin and surrounding terrain. "Got questions about the death of her husband," Marshal Garrett said. "New evidence suggests it might not have been the accident we originally thought." "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that needs to be discussed with Mrs. Dalton herself." Garrett's tone remained professional, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. "Now, is she here or not?" Before Luka could respond, Prudence stepped out onto the porch beside him, her weapon visible but not directly threatening. The sight of her seemed to settle something in Marshal Garrett's expression. Relief, perhaps, at finding his quarry after a long search. "I'm Prudence Dalton," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "Though it's Prudence Blackwood now." "What evidence are you talking about?" "Ma'am." Garrett touched his hat brim in acknowledgement. "Might we come closer? This seems like a conversation better held without shouting." Luka's grip tightened, almost imperceptibly on his rifle. In war, he had learned that the most dangerous moments often came wrapped in courtesy and reasonable requests. "You can talk from there just fine." "What's this evidence you mentioned?" Marshal Garrett exchanged a glance with his tracker before continuing. "James Dalton's business partner came forward 6 months after the funeral. Claims your late husband confided in him about fearing for his safety. Said you'd threatened him during one of your domestic disputes." Prudence felt the words hit her like physical blows, each one designed to undermine the careful peace she had built. "George Patterson," she said, the name bitter on her tongue. "James's drinking partner and enabler. What did he claim I threatened?" "Said you told your husband you'd kill him if he laid hands on you again," Garrett replied. "And that James was found at the bottom of those stairs with defensive wounds on his hands, like he'd been fighting someone off." The lies mixed with enough truth to be plausible, and Prudence recognized the trap closing around her. Patterson had indeed been James's closest friend, a man who had watched her husband's violence escalate without ever intervening. Now, apparently, he had found a way to profit from that knowledge. "Even if that were true," Luka interjected, "defending yourself against a violent husband isn't murder. It's survival. That's for a jury to decide," Marshal Garrett said. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us. Peacefully if possible, and if she refuses? The tracker spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the faint accent of someone for whom English was a second language. Then we wait. Winter's over, but spring storms still close the passes sometimes. Might be a long wait. Luka understood the implication immediately. They were prepared for a siege, confident that time and weather would work in their favor. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They had underestimated what a man would do to protect the woman he loved, and the home they had built together. Prudence, he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the two men below. Go inside. Check the back windows. She hesitated for a moment, unwilling to leave him alone to face this threat. But trust won over fear, and she slipped back into the cabin to follow his instructions. What she saw through the kitchen window made her blood run cold. A third man, moving carefully through the trees behind their cabin, a rifle in his hands, and the patient look of a hunter closing in on wounded prey. 3 men, Prudence called softly from inside the cabin, her voice carrying the controlled tension of someone who had learned to function under pressure. One coming through the trees behind us. Luka's jaw tightened, but his external calm never wavered. He had faced worse odds at Antietam, had learned that panic was more dangerous than any enemy bullet. The key was to turn their opponent's confidence against them, to make them believe they held all the advantages until the moment those advantages disappeared. Marshal Garrett, he called out, his voice carrying across the clearing with deadly courtesy. Seems like you brought more men than you mentioned. That suggests you're not as interested in peaceful resolution as you claimed. A moment of silence followed, then Garrett's voice, slightly less certain now. We're authorized to use whatever force necessary to bring Mrs. Blackwood back for trial. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Hard. Luka laughed, a sound without humor that had made Confederate soldiers take cover during the war. You have no idea what hard looks like yet. Inside the cabin, Prudence moved to the position Luka had taught her during their winter preparations, the corner where she could watch both approaches while remaining protected by the thick log walls. Her carbine felt solid and familiar in her hands now, no longer the foreign instrument it had been months ago. Mrs. Blackwood, Marshal Garrett called out, his tone shifting toward something approaching pleading. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed. You come with us willing, and your husband here can go about his business. Nobody needs to get hurt. It was then that Prudence understood the true power of the choice before her. Not the choice between surrender and resistance, but the choice between the woman she had been, frightened, powerless, accepting whatever fate others imposed, and the woman she had become in these mountains. Marshal Garrett, she called back, stepping into the doorway beside Luka so the lawman could see her clearly. I have something to tell you about James Dalton's death. You ready to confess, ma'am? I'm ready to tell you the truth, Prudence replied, her voice carrying across the clearing with absolute clarity. James Dalton was a drunk and a wife-beater who spent 3 years making my life a living hell. The night he died, he came home looking for someone to blame for his failures, same as always. When I tried to get away from him, he grabbed me, hit me, threatened to do worse. She paused, feeling the weight of 3 years' silence lifting from her shoulders like morning mist. So I pushed him away. Not hard, not viciously, but hard enough to save myself from another beating. He was drunk, lost his balance, fell down those stairs. And you know what, Marshal? I watched him die and I was glad. Not because I wanted him dead, but because I finally didn't have to be afraid anymore. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire valley. Even the wind in the pines seemed to hold its breath. So there's your confession, Prudence continued. A woman defending herself against a man who would have killed her eventually. If you think that's murder, then come and take me. But understand, I'm not the same frightened woman who lived in Kansas City. I won't go quietly, and my husband won't let you take me without a fight. Marshal Garrett sat his horse for a long moment, and Prudence could see the conflict playing across his weathered features. He was a lawman, bound by duty and oath, but he was also a man who had likely seen enough domestic violence to understand the reality behind her words. That's quite a story, ma'am, he said finally. But it's still for a jury to decide. Is it? Luka asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Tell me, Marshal, what kind of evidence does George Patterson really have? Because I'm guessing it's the kind that disappears when someone offers him enough money to forget what he thinks he saw. The tracker shifted uneasily in his saddle, and something in his movement caught Luka's attention. The man's rifle was no longer pointed casually downward. It was angled toward the cabin, ready for quick use. Last chance, Marshal Garrett said, his voice hardening. Come peaceful, or we take you by force. It was then that the weather, which had been building towards something all morning, finally made its presence known. The first fat snowflakes began to fall, carried on a wind that spoke of serious weather moving in from the peaks. Within minutes, the scattered flakes became a steady fall, then a genuine storm that began to blur the distance between the cabin and the waiting lawmen. Looks like winter's not quite done with us, Luka observed, noting how the storm was affecting visibility and making precise shooting more difficult. Funny how mountain weather can change so quick. Marshal Garrett looked up at the rapidly deteriorating conditions and seemed to reach a decision. Jenkins, he called to the man in the trees, move in. We're not sitting out here in a blizzard. And with those words, the careful standoff dissolved into the kind of violence that Luka had hoped to avoid, but had always known was inevitable. Spring came to their valley 3 months later, with a gentleness that seemed impossible after the violence of that snowy March afternoon. Prudence sat on the porch they had rebuilt together, her fingers working steadily at the quilt that had occupied her through the long winter nights. A wedding ring, pattern in blues and golds that caught the morning light like captured sunshine. The final confrontation had lasted less than an hour, but its resolution had surprised everyone involved, including Luka, who had prepared for a much different outcome. When Jenkins, the third man, had tried to approach the cabin through the storm, he had encountered not bullets, but the treacherous ice that had formed over the creek behind their home. His cries for help, as he broke through into the freezing water, had changed everything in an instant. Luka had emerged from the cabin without his rifle, moving quickly to pull the half-drowned man from the creek, while Prudence covered him from the doorway. That single act of mercy towards someone who had been hunting them had shifted the entire dynamic of their standoff. You could have let him drown, Marshal Garrett had observed later, as they all crowded into the cabin while Jenkins recovered by the fire, wrapped in Prudence's quilts and drinking coffee laced with whiskey. Could have, Luka agreed. But that wouldn't have made us the kind of people worth defending. The tracker, whose name proved to be Joseph Standing Bear, had been the first to speak the truth that everyone was thinking. This woman is no killer, he had said, watching Prudence tend to Jenkins with the same care she would have shown anyone in need. A killer does not risk her own safety to save the man hunting her. What followed was not the violent resolution Luka had prepared for, but something much more powerful. A conversation that lasted through the night as the storm raged outside. Marshal Garrett proved to be a man capable of recognizing justice when he saw it, even when it didn't match the letter of the law he had sworn to uphold. George Patterson withdrew his statement 2 weeks after we left Kansas City, he admitted, as they shared the last of Prudence's coffee. Seems someone convinced him that bearing false witness was a sin, and that continued lying might be hazardous to his health. Someone? Luka had asked. Your sister, Garrett said to Prudence. Charlotte Brennan. Turns out her husband has considerable influence in certain circles. Amazing how quickly a man's memory improves when his drinking debts come due all at once. The revelation that Charlotte had been working behind the scenes to protect her had brought tears to Prudence's eyes. Family loyalty, it seemed, ran deeper than distance or time. By morning, Marshal Garrett had made his decision. Far as I'm concerned, he announced over breakfast, Prudence Dalton died in Kansas City 3 years ago. Never did track down where she went after that. Trail went cold somewhere in Colorado Territory. Now, sitting in the spring sunshine with her needlework, Prudence reflected on how profoundly her life had changed since that October day when she had stepped off Pete Morrison's wagon expecting rejection and finding instead a love deeper than anything she had dared hope for. The valley around them showed signs of the life they had built together over the months. A larger garden plot turned and ready for planting. A chicken coop that Luka had expanded to accommodate the additional hens they had ordered. A small corral where Minerva grazed contentedly with the new colt she had foaled just after the snow melted. "Admiring your handiwork?" Luka asked, settling beside her on the bench they had built to catch the morning sun. His hair was damp from washing at the creek, and his sleeves rolled up from the morning chores that had become as natural as breathing. "Admiring all of it," Prudence replied, gesturing toward the valley that had become truly home. "Hard to believe how much has changed since last fall." "You've changed," Luka observed, noting the confident set of her shoulders, the way she met his eyes without the careful hesitation that had marked their early days together. "Not just the circumstances, you." "We both have," she said, reaching for his hand and finding the calluses that spoke of honest work, the scars that told stories of survival. "I used to think love was something that happened to you, like weather or illness, something you endured or enjoyed but couldn't control. And now I know it's something you build, day by day, choice by choice. Like this quilt, each stitch deliberate, each pattern piece cut with care and purpose." That afternoon, they rode together up to the high meadow where they had first seen the elk, now green with new grass and dotted with wildflowers. The peace that had eluded Prudence for so many years felt solid now, built on foundations stronger than fear or necessity. "Been thinking about names," Luka said, as they dismounted near the stream that fed their valley. "Names? For children eventually, if we're blessed that way." The possibility, once too fragile to speak aloud, now seemed natural as spring following winter. Prudence leaned against his shoulder, watching clouds drift across peaks that no longer seemed like barriers, but like guardians protecting the life they had built together. "Something strong," she said finally. "Something that speaks of new beginnings." As evening painted the mountains in shades of rose and gold, they rode home to the cabin that held all their hopes and dreams. Behind them, the high country stretched toward horizons they might explore together. Ahead lay a future built on love that had grown not from perfection, but from the courage to accept and be accepted exactly as they were. Sometimes the most beautiful moments in life come when we least expect them, and often when we feel least worthy of them. In a world that constantly tells us we're not enough, Prudence and Luka had found something rare and precious, a love that saw past every flaw and found beauty in every imperfection. Their story was complete, but their life together was just beginning.